After weeks of dissent within his own party, Alberta Premier Jason Kenney's UCP MLAs voted 2 colleagues out of caucus. Todd, Loewen, and Drew Barnes were voted out the day after Loewen stepped down as caucus chair and called for Kenney's resignation. Both MLAs had concerns with the Premier's handling of the pandemic, and Barnes had beefs on everything from COVID-19 to the Fair Deal panel. But what goes into a decision to vote MLAs out of caucus? And what's the fallout for the Premier and the government now that they're gone? My guest today, Danielle Smith. She's the president of the Alberta Enterprise Group and former leader of the official opposition in Alberta. And Thomas Lukaszuk, who served as MLA in Edmonton Castle Downs for 14 or 15 years. Thanks very much for joining me.
Thanks, Dave.
Thanks for having us.
All right. Well, let's get to it. You know, as both of you are actively watching Alberta politics, we all saw that the UCP caucus voted out 2 of its members, Todd, Loewen, and Drew Barnes. Were either of you surprised to see that move by the UCP caucus? Danielle, let's start with you.
I think it was an error because I think part of the problem is that the underlying issues that caused Todd Loewen and Drew Barnes to speak out are still there. And there are at least 15 other caucus members who share some of the same concerns. And so by making martyrs of the 2, there's a real potential that others could end up following if the Premier doesn't end up addressing some of the reasons why they chose to speak out in the first place. And it is a pretty dramatic move to kick somebody out. Todd Loewen, maybe more so. I mean, if you're calling for the boss to resign, maybe that's more legitimate. But Drew Barnes has been pretty active and vocal for the last year. It seemed like it was sweeping him out unfairly, in my view. And I still don't understand why it is that the other ML, I think it was Dave Hansen, who said that he should resign. I don't understand why he didn't get punished. So it's created a little bit of confusion, I think, within the caucus. And I expect that it's really just the beginning.
Yeah. Thomas, what about you? What were your initial thoughts with this move?
Well, I tend to agree with Danielle. The Premier caught himself in a little bit of cross-messaging. As Drew Barnes was objecting to many of the measures that Premier was taking relevant to COVID, whether you agree with them or not, he clearly was not in sync with the Premier. Premier was saying that he welcomes diversity of opinions in caucus and was actually quite happy that opposing opinions are being vocalized by his MLAs. And then another MLA calls for his resignation and boom, Mr. Barnes get punted as well. He wasn't the one asking for Kenney's resignation. So if Kenney really wants diversity in his caucus, why was Barnes thrown out of caucus and not just Loewen for asking for his resignation? And yet another MLA who agrees with both of them seems to be still in caucus. So there isn't really any clear direction now what is and what isn't allowed. Yet we know there are 15 MLAs who signed a letter who are not happy with the Premier. We know that there is a letter with some 600 signatures right now from UCP members asking for the Premier to resign. So I agree with Danielle. I think we haven't seen the end of this yet.
Now, Danielle, as someone who served as a party leader and who has had to deal with calls for you to discipline candidates or deal with people who are expressing views that may not be in line with the party or with the mainstream Albertans, what do you suppose goes into a decision like this? Or what is the Premier and other members of his caucus or cabinet kind of discussing behind the scenes when they're approaching a vote like this to expel 2 members from caucus?
I'm sure Thomas will have a different answer than me because the Wildrose caucus had a bit of a different culture. And it was one that I started out wanting to allow the maximum amount of freedom and free votes and grassroots representation of constituents and the notion that you could say something controversial, but it didn't bind the entire party. I mean, obviously, that didn't work out very well for us in 2012 because what you discover is that the extreme views of one person can end up taking down the entire caucus. So I think what often happens in these discussions, and we're seeing that the Conservative parties are moving more towards this, Aaron O'Toole did it at the federal level as well, is that if the team feels that one of the members is a liability, that's where the discussion takes place. And it really is becoming a bit of a caucus-led decision. It's one thing to be a bit of a lone wolf and to represent your constituents and to stand apart, but you also are a member of a team. And there's some issues that have to be put aside to make sure that people don't feel alienated. And I'm sure that was part of the discussion that took place. Again, from what I understand, it was a harder case to make against Todd Loewen, because he's a pretty popular guy. I think he makes waffles when they have some of those late night sessions, so people really like him. And so he was asking his caucus to choose between their loyalty to a caucus mate and friend who'd led the caucus, Todd Loewen, versus the premier. And that, I think, put them in a pretty tough bind. It's probably why it took a couple of hours for them to come to a conclusion that both should go.
Mm-hmm. Now, Thomas, you were in the PC caucus for a number of years. You were around back when Fort McMurray area MLA Guy Boutelier was voted out of caucus after making some pretty public criticism about, I believe it was a long-term care center up in Fort McMurray. But what's it like to be in the room when you're having these discussions about getting rid of one of your own from the family, essentially? Like, does voting someone out of caucus kind of bring relief to the group to say, okay, well, we're done with this particular person, and now we can move on and deal with the issue of governing? Or does it create dissension within the ranks? Does it cause more problems perhaps than they hope?
Well, and not only Guy Boutelier, but also Dr. Lyle Oberg and Roy Sherman were removed from our PC caucus. It never causes relief, because particularly if a given MLA actually has support of other MLAs in that caucus. Now, this is the case in UCP, where these MLAs clearly have support and are like-minded with other MLAs in their caucus. Whereas in the case of Guy Boutelier, Oberg, and Sherman, that was not the case. They were lone wolves. And even though, again, it was a lengthy discussion in caucus and a secret vote on removing each and every one of them, it was not an easy decision. You, like Danielle said, you spend many long nights in that building together. You travel together. You become a little bit of a dysfunctional family. And then removing a person from a caucus is never easy. But we didn't have the problem where there was a group of supporting MLAs expressing the same opinions. Now, Kenney has another problem. Premier Kenney has another problem. He went out of his way and he handpicked his caucus to a large extent, and he was quite accepting of a bit of a libertarian slant among some MLAs. And when you're in opposition, then that's fine. At the end of the day, you don't govern, and if you have some renegade MLAs, unless they really go, out of line, you can deal with that. But as a government and as a cabinet, as a governing caucus, you have to have a unified message. And now when you have 15 MLAs running around and saying something contrary to the government policy, particularly during a time when, it's sort of life and death decisions in some cases, that is a problem for the premier.
And I think Thomas is right about that. It's the mixed message, because remember, he got elected touting the grassroots guarantee. He said that his members were going to create policy. When I was on radio and interviewed him about what the pathway was for MLAs to raise concerns about how some of the COVID restrictions were being implemented, he said, well, that's the job of an MLA, is to bring these issues forward in the legislature. So he was giving a signal to his MLAs that he thought it was their job to raise these issues. And then, of course, when they did, it turned out the other way. So I think that's part of the premier's problem, is that he could have started into COVID by saying, look, guys, I know I said grassroots, but it stops here. We're in an emergency and you all got to fall into line. But because he was giving those mixed messages all along, I think that that ended up creating a lot of frustration, because I think a lot of the MLAs felt they were doing the right thing. They were encouraged to do it. And now they don't really know. They don't know where the line is.
Could removing the two of them kind of lead to more problems than they initially had, now that they don't necessarily have to worry about, whether they've gone too far or whether they're stepping on anybody's toes? I mean, I know Drew Barnes has been outspoken for, as long as he's been an MLA. He's not been silent on issues, but does this potentially put them in a position to be more vocal critics of the government and lead to more problems for Kenney among the grassroots of the party?
I can take that because I'll tell you,
Sure.
when I got into politics, there weren't any MLAs for the Wildrose in the legislature. I was running for leader, and the first breakthrough came when Paul Hinman ended up getting reelected in that riding. That created a toehold. And then 3 of the PC MLAs came over. And then you had a caucus of 4. And so when you have a certain size caucus, that's when you can start getting separate research funding and separate funding and questions in question period. And you can really start gaining some momentum. So 2 might not do it. But if there is a couple of others that feel equally disgruntled and end up joining, I think there seems to be, once you've hit 4, that seems to be the magic number for when the media starts going to you as a separate voice, and it's when you start getting the profile. I don't know if that will happen. I think that the Premier has an opportunity over the next month to, as soon as he reaches the targets that he's trying to on the COVID vaccination and he starts reducing the restrictions, and then he can turn to his positive messaging about how we're going to get the economy moving again. A lot can change in a year, and it could be, if no others join Drew Barnes and Todd Loewen, it could be just an anomaly. So it's really, this next month is pretty crucial for him.
Yeah, Thomas, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that would be nice for the Premier, but now you're going to have these 2 liberated MLAs sitting in the House and really enjoying their freedom and attacking both the NDP and the Premier equally, however they like. And that will be something that some of the MLAs in the Premier's caucus are going to look at quite carefully, because they have a lot to say. They have constituents that want them to say certain things. As I said earlier, they have a little bit of a libertarian slant to them, and they won't be able to do those things. So it will be tempting for them to join that group. They have nothing to lose. They are backbenchers. In Alberta, you don't get paid anymore for sitting on committees, so there's no financial benefit of being in a backbencher in a government caucus. So they might as well do it. But these floor crossing, one thing we're forgetting, but those are only symptoms of a bigger problem. No one ever gets punted out of caucus. No one ever asks a Premier to resign when the Premier is popular himself, when they know they're going to get reelected with this Premier on this team. Now they know that the Premier may actually be a liability. And some of them are thinking, I may actually have a better chance of getting elected without this Premier than with this Premier. And that is the kind of thinking that probably gave rise to all of it in the first place. Nobody was calling for Stelmach's resignations and Alison Redford's resignation, or even nobody was pushing Ralph Klein out the door until Cabinet and caucus realized and said, wait a minute, this guy may cost us an election. And that is probably the thinking, and that is why they're even asking him for resignation.
Well, and this is the interesting thing, is that the PC party used to have effective ways of removing a leader that was seen to be a liability. Even if you look at Ralph Klein, didn't get a high enough amount of votes on his leadership review. Then Ed Stelmach, I think a group led by Ted Morton. So he sort of put himself out as an heir apparent. I don't know exactly how Alison Redford made the decision to go, but it was same thing. It was caucus driven. I don't know that there's that same mechanism left in this UCP party. I don't know that there is a cohesive enough group within the caucus, because so many of them are brand new. They haven't seen each other in over a year. So I don't know if there's the same mechanism to do that. And the Premier seems to have been doing quite a bit of work to make sure that the grassroots effort to call for an early leadership review from the presidents has stalled. Last I heard, I think it was 12 or 14 constituencies. I think they need to get up to 23 to call an early leadership vote. So I don't know that there's the same mechanism to remove a leader as there has been in previous years. Maybe Thomas would know otherwise. But well, it doesn't seem to me that there is.
You're right, Danielle. And what Kenney has done is he moved the leadership review so far, so close to the next election, knowing that even if he was the least popular Premier, UCP will not take a chance and do a leadership race just before an election. So he almost forced UCP to keep him as a leader if they were to use that process. No secret. If a rebellion starts brewing within caucus, and Alison Redford would be the best example, you will start seeing them meeting and having their own separate caucus meetings behind the scenes. And finally, they will approach cabinet ministers or minister to message the premier that if she doesn't resign, they will. Ralph Klein didn't have that problem. He simply had a leadership review. But Stelmach and Redford were clearly messaged that if they don't resign, cabinet members and even backbenchers will be stepping down or crossing the floor. And both of them made the right decision at the right time. I'm not sure if Kenney is there yet, but I think that mechanism is in the making right now.
Do you think Kenney is also benefits from the fact that, despite having some popular members of cabinet, that there isn't the kind of breadth of, potential leaders in waiting, that a lot of the party is so built around him and his popularity in uniting both parties that there isn't, as you called Ted Morton, Danielle, the heir apparent to take over for him?
Yeah, you're very right. I mean, the names that I think people put forward as a potential replacement is someone like Doug Schweitzer, who I think is a terrific guy, but he's really new. And so it'd be a pretty green move, I think, for them to replace a veteran like Kenney with somebody that brand new who is a relative unknown. I think that's part of the reason why Brian Jean has been lobbing the grenades the premier's way, is that I don't think that Brian Jean wants to split the movement. In fact, he has said, I helped to bring this movement together. I don't want to see it bust apart. But I think he's letting people know, should you make the decision, I'm here. And I don't know if we'll start seeing more of that. I mean, there are others who have the kind of outside profile that might allow them to step in. Thomas Lukaszuk might be one. Michelle,
do you see me nodding no?
Michelle Rempel might be one. I don't know if Ronna Ambrose would ever be persuaded to come back in. But I think that there's my sense of it is that what is different this time is that everybody who went through all the blood, sweat, and tears to try to bring this movement together, no one wants to be the person that rips it apart again. But there would be people who would step forward to put their name forward for leadership if it does happen that he is replaced. I admire Paul Hindman. He's been a longtime friend, but I don't think that the Wildrose Independence Party is a vehicle that would be able to draw enough votes from the public to win a majority government, or enough MLAs in order to be a real threat to the premier. So there isn't really an alternative vehicle other than the UCP, and it doesn't look like the premier is going to be abandoning the post.
And that's the strength and the weakness of the UCP party. It really is a Jason Kenney party. In absence of Jason Kenney, it's hard to imagine what this party would look like. It's my understanding that veteran MLAs like Rick McIver also may be considering stepping into that if an opportunity arose. But Jason Kenney knows that without him, this all falls apart. And also he knows that if they were to call an early election, it would, at this point, it seems, would look like a loss. And he is using that as a little bit of a hammer over caucus. Do you really want me gone? If I'm gone, all of you are going down with me.
Mm-hmm. Now, one thing that's been talked about a lot since since Loewen's letter came out and called for the premier's resignation, and then they were voted out of caucus, is who's next, or when does the other shoe drop? And so far that hasn't happened. Thomas, do you think that we'll see more people kind of speak up either against the premier or decide to sit as an independent? And if so, when may that happen? Is it a longer process than people think it may be?
I don't believe that Loewen had a sleepless night and literally drafted a letter at midnight and sent it out first thing in the morning to Premier Caucus and many, many, many others. He is a very smart individual, and to make a decision like this was well thought out and well planned out. And I am almost certain that there were other caucus members that knew that he was going to do it. He simply was the first brave one to do it. And I imagine there is a little bit of a plan in place. And if you want to kill a premier, you do it by 1,000 stabs, not just all at once, because if it's all at once, Premier can deal with this quite effectively. So I'm suspicious, and I'm thinking that there will be other MLAs in a well planned out manner dropping additional bombs in front of the Premier.
Danielle, last word to you on this.
I think the Premier's problem is he's not the guy that everybody elected driving around Alberta in the big blue truck. And I think that he needs to return to being that guy. He used to be pretty accessible. I mean, one of the things I always remember about Jason Kenney at an event is he let out a big, healthy guffaw when he found something hilarious. And he was the most extroverted and outgoing politician. He would go to literally dozens of events on weekends and glad hand. And it sounds to me like he's not even talking to anyone, not having cabinet meetings, not talking to his caucus. There are members of his caucus who've literally talked to him less than 5 times in 2 years. And I think if he doesn't rebuild those relationships, he is going to end up with some enormous problems. I don't know if he'll be able to solve those. And I'm not quite sure why it is. Maybe he's just been in that kind of emergency mode for too long, but he needs to take a break and kind of get back to being the politician he was that ended up causing his success. Otherwise, it's only going to go worse for him from here.
Well, Danielle, I think Kenney is a fabulous number 2, but not number 1. He was the great glad-hander to Harper, while Harper was the boring politician making boring but important decisions. Now he's number 1, and it's just not his style. And that's why I think UCP caucus is asking itself, who is this guy? We don't agree with him on so many different things.
Yeah, and you're right. One last thing. I mean, if he's going to turn into Harper, then he needs a number 2. He needs the person who can make the phone calls and make people feel good and feel like they're being heard. And I don't get the sense that anybody feels like they can get through to him or that they're being listened to. And that's just a recipe for collapse.
That's an interesting point, and we'll have to leave it there for now. Danielle Smith, Thomas Lukaszuk, thanks again. That's it for this edition of Under the Dome. Don't forget you can find all past episodes at edmontonjournal.com/underthedome, or you can hit that subscribe button on YouTube. I'm Dave Breakenridge. We'll see you next time.